It is Tuesday, and if you have been tuning in recently over the last several weeks, then you will know that linguist Bernie Francis has been dropping in almost weekly to give us some lessons in Mi'kmaq and the language and the insights the language offers into the Mi'kmaq worldview. Today, we want to kind of go back and tie up a few loose ends. So, Bernie, Pichalasi.
Well, Alinjinam.
Begomuksan.
Akil Begomuksan. Thank you very much.
So last time you were here, and I had a lot of feedback on this on social media, the verb-based language, and the idea that God in Mi'kmaq is a verb.
Absolutely.
And the verb is, remind me.
Gisulk.
Gisulk.
Right, exactly.
Gisulk. That is the verb.
Right, and it means he or she or it that created us.
But now you've heard from some people who were confused by that.
Right. They were confused by it simply because they heard the word niskam. Now, the word niskam is used sometime, not as much as gizulk. Niskam comes from the time when the missionaries were first here, and they had every intention, of course, of granting us a soul, which they supposedly did in 1610. So I have a soul now.
How grateful are you for that?
I want to let you know this, Jeff. They wanted to come up with a word that was more satisfactory to their beliefs than it was to the Mi'kmaq people. Now, Gisulk to them was not satisfactory because it could be a he, a she, or a sentient it. It's not just any old it, it's an it that feels and sees and uses the senses much like we do. That's the perfect, and that is the perfect word for the Creator, as well as it fits in perfectly with the rest of the language and the spirituality. The word niskam is something, the missionaries worked very hard to come up with something that satisfied them. So our word for grandfather in the Mi'kmaq language is niskamij. Niskamij. It ends in IJ. Well, what the missionaries did in order to satisfy their beliefs is to get rid of those last two letters, namely the I and the J at the end of that word, and leave us with the word niskam. Now they are guaranteed that God is male.
God's a dude.
The dude, exactly.
They wanted that. They needed that.
They needed that. They certainly couldn't take the chance that someone might just think that God could be a female.
Okay, so that then for those of you who were maybe had heard niskam before and gisulk was new to you, there is the explanation for where that one is a more, I guess, indigenous understanding of Creator,
right,
and the other is just dogma.
Right, exactly. Well, see, gisulk is the verb, as I said, and that makes great sense in Mi'kmaq spirituality. Niskam is not a verb, it's a noun. And it's not even a correct noun because it was altered by the missionaries.
Niskamij.
It came from niskamij, which means grandfather, and they sort of imposed it on the Mi'kmaq people because of their beliefs.
Well, let's talk about some of the other difficulties that when missionaries were trying to lay this religion on to give you a soul and to do you various other quote unquote favors by giving you this religion.
Don't laugh, Jeff.
No, I can see. It's clear that you have soul, man. It's clear that you have soul. That the concept, because what we said last week, we just touched on it at the end of our conversation last week about the words for father, mother, sister, brother, that these were all had to be I think the term was personalized, you said in some way? Possessed.
Right.
That's it.
Yeah, I don't mean possessed by the devil either.
No. But now that you have a soul, Bernie, that is something you should probably...
I'll pay attention to it. Yes, I will. Yeah.
But tell us how... let's revisit that concept then about that there's no generic or general, I guess, concept of father, mother...
Right.
That
exactly.
They have to be attached to something. Can you explain us a little
Right.
more?
Well, first of all, the terminology that linguists use are alienably possessed and inalienably possessed nouns. That is, there are some nouns in the Mi'kmaq language which are impossible of not being possessed. Someone has to own them, in other words. There are no pure words for mother, father, son, daughter, and words like that. They have when you want to describe or want to talk about your father, there's what's called a possessive prefix in the word, which is the letter N. So when you talk about your father, you say nuch, for example, and that N is a possessive prefix which says my. So it's my father. And then if it's your father, it has to be a K. That would be the possessive prefix for the second person singular. And the W is the possessive prefix for the third person singular, you see. So they have to be possessed. And one of the great difficulties that the missionaries had was, how are they going to deal with teaching the Mi'kmaq people, the missionaries being the Catholics that they were, how are they going to teach the Mi'kmaq people how to say, how to bless themselves, namely, in the name of the Father and of the Son, when there are no words like that in Mi'kmaq to cover that? Well, they had a real hard time, but I'm sure they were quite intelligent people. They were quite smart, and they managed to circumvent the problem by saying things like, the first one, Danteluisid Wegwisid Niskam. That's how it starts, in the name of the Father. Now that, translated correctly, it means in the name of the Father who has a Son. That's what it does. And the reason being is that you cannot be a father unless you're someone's father.
Yes.
That's the way it is in Mi'kmaq. You can't say the word father by itself. But if you're going to be a father, you have to be someone's father. That's another thing. It's kind of ridiculous to call a priest father when, let's assume that he's not a father of anyone. He could be a son, but not a father of anyone.
But that's really interesting. That raises a whole other question, because that church existed in this kind of, there was a patriarchy implicit in it.
Well, yeah.
That was so
alien.
Would be so alien.
Exactly. That's right. They just had a real rough time with that. So another thing, when you get to the second part of that blessing, for example, they'll say, and of the Son. Well, if we have no word for son, I mean S-O-N, then you have to get around to so. So then the missionary said, "Danteluisid Wegwisid Niskam, in the name of the Father."
Who has a son?
Yeah, whose father has an Euchid Niskam, and the son who has a father, because you cannot be a son without a father. You see, that's just, it just makes perfect sense in Mi'kmaq spirituality. And but the priests at the time, the missionary priest, had a hard time with dealing with those things. So what they do then, they fix that up by going around it and saying, in the name of the Father who has a son, and of the Son who has a father. That's the way they got around it. And every other little thing that they had, including the words which were held in reverence.
That had to have caused a confusion, I guess, or a discord between the settlers and the Mi'kmaq who were here, who were here.
Right, exactly. But you see, the thing is, the settlers really couldn't understand the conceptual differences in Mi'kmaq, let's say from French or from English, you see. So the problem was somewhat satisfactory to the Mi'kmaq people in the early days, of course, to appease the missionaries too, because they were, at that time they were threatening us with what we call Mandu and hell and everything else, And so they accepted this thing in the name of the Father who has a son.
Which made no sense to them.
That's right. But they accepted it. But the French and the English at that time had no idea what was going on.
So are you sort of inferring that, like, it was just like, well, clearly they want us to do this thing and we'll do it? Like, it was just a political, or we clearly have to do this little ceremony to make things, to smooth the waters?
Right. Well, one of the things which really impressed the Mi'kmaq people in the early days was the written word. Mm-hmm. They really were quite impressed that the way that they put it was someone could put his thoughts on paper, send them to another guy, and that other guy would be able to read those thoughts, you see.
No.
Very, very, and so of course when they saw the Bible and they saw all these words, of course they were told this is directly from God. It was a very...
this is directly from the Father who has a son.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. So that's the way it was. They were quite impressed with a few things. And of course, they kept the peace, and they looked after the priest and made sure that they were well and so on, just like they did with everybody else that came across the shores.
In Christianity, there is that, propensity, I guess, in some sects to say God says this, God says that, right, wrong, this, that.
Right.
In traditional Mi'kmaq spirituality, is there any talk like that? Like, God says this, God?
Oh, not that God says this or God says that. the humans say this or that.
Okay.
And of course, human beings, just like everywhere, they understand, they know the difference between love and hatred, shall we say. They know the difference between looking after someone and killing them. Why, it makes sense that you do not go and kill your neighbor. You do not do all kinds of things that would harm anyone else. So it's not that does anyone need God to tell them that? Well, in the Mi'kmaq culture, no. Use your head. I mean, just pay attention to how the culture is behaving, and you'll realize that the best way to live in a community is to love your neighbor, as Jesus said.
Okay, Bernie Francis, the soul man, Mi'kmaq elder and linguist.
It's a Mi'kmaq soul, man.
Mi'kmaq soul.
Yeah.
Oh, funky.
Yeah.
So, Bernie, now I don't know if it was in the last conversation this came up. It might have been a couple of conversations ago, but we were talking about pronouns.
Right.
And about he, she, and you said that in Mi'kmaq there is a word, negum.
Negum, exactly
Negum.
right. Yeah. Well, first of all, the word negum is a fantastic word that could be used today, particularly the LGBTQ community that's always looking for a word that might satisfy people who don't want to be identified as either male or female, or something like that. Well, we would like to donate a word from the Mi'kmaq language, and the word is negum, and it's spelled Nekm. Now, you'll recognize that the K sounds like an English G.
Yes.
But really, it's Nekm. And that word means he or she. You'll notice that in Spanish and Italian and in Portuguese and in French that they have their pronouns he and she.
Yeah.
And so does English. Mi'kmaq does not. Our nouns are divided into as to whether they're animate or inanimate. But to go back to this particular word, when you say Allah negum, you're saying that person. You're not
that individual.
That individual. You're not making the distinction as to whether that person is male or female, you see? So that's why I thought many times, even the times around 1973, 1974, when Gloria Steinem was putting out T-shirts that said, God, we love her. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
At that time, the problem, I could have easily said it to her had I met her, that the problem she was having was with the English language, that the filter that she was using at the time was English. Had we been around, had I been close to her, I'd said, look, it's only a language problem you're having. We'll give you a word that will satisfy you, and it's negum, and that looks after male, female, those two in particular.
So what would have traditional Mi'kmaq views about gender have been then? What does that indicate to us?
No, nothing special really. I mean, I can assure you that if you came to any reserves, you will see a lot of children running around. That will tell you that we know quite a bit we know the difference between males and females. We have lots of them. But you see, it's nothing major. We don't have a matriarchal society as some people have suggested that we do. We didn't. We still don't. We have what's called a matrilineal society, which is quite a bit different. That means everything sort of your relations and so on falls on the mother's side. But that's quite a bit different from a hierarchical thing, you see. So we use the word negum because males, females, equal partners in life.
Finally, Bernie, as we're tidying up loose ends here, one of our first conversations was about the orthography, which you were a partner in creating.
Yes.
And I've had a couple of questions over just from people who have heard these segments about how to read when they see the orthography.
Right.
Just if there are certain letters silent, what the apostrophe means. So
actually, nobody would be foolish enough to create silent letters or incorporate them into a language where silent letters serve no purpose.
English has them. We have them.
English has them, but for a reason. It's because they did not change the orthography when the language changed. That's the only reason why they're there. Oh. That's why you have words like the word night, correctly pronounced, it will be nicht. So you pronounce everything there, N-I-G-H-T. But when you say night, you do not pronounce everything. You miss the G and the H. Well, the language changed, but the orthography didn't. That's
so
the only reason.
We have an obsolete orthography.
Absolutely right, yeah.
Okay.
Great language, English, but the orthography's got a problem. But in Mi'kmaq, when we were developing it, starting in 1974, we operated on what is known as the phonemic principle. And the phonemic principle simply states that for every one letter, you should have one sound. For every one sound, you should have one letter. Simple as that. If you have 10 letters in a word, you should have 10 sounds. And that's it. There are no silent letters. It would make, I've yet to come across a reason as to why silent letters would serve of some value, but they certainly don't. The other thing is, you asked me about the apostrophe. Well, we use the apostrophe for this only. When we use vowels, we have, in the orthography, we have 6 short vowels and 5 long vowels. The short vowels are A, E, I, O, U, and And it's the schwa. English uses it all the time, practically in every sentence, but yet they don't write it. It'll come to you as an E, an I, or an A, something like that.
Like earth.
Yeah, that's right. Like earth, like the E in earth, for example. That's right. That's a schwa. So we have to actually write it because sometimes it distinguishes between the present and future tense. So we have no choice but to write it. No big deal. So we have 5 short vowels. Then we have 5 long vowels, which are also A, E, I, O, U, and there is no long schwa. Okay? So what we do, the apostrophe simply signifies that the A is pronounced longer. Let's say a short A then is A, and a long A is Ah. You see? Mm-hmm. And what I say about that vowel applies to all of the other vowels. So you will see the apostrophe. Every time that we have to use a long vowel, we will use an apostrophe to indicate, to pronounce it long. Because you can have words such as gesalul, gesalul, and gesalul. Those words are all spelled exactly the same. But one of them means I love you. The other one means I'm hurting you by twisting your arm, and the other one means I'm throwing you into fire. So those long vowels are very crucial.
I think that's a fine note to end it on, Bernie. We'll leave it with you still loving me because it goes downhill from there. I can see.
Exactly, it could.
Bernie, thank you so much for this.
Thank you very much.
We'll talk to you next week. Bernie Francis is a Mi'kmaq elder and a linguist. He has been teaching us about the Mi'kmaq language and culture.
This is CBC.